Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So, if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times. So, stick around. So, if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 40, in which Alma talks to his son Corianton about the resurrection. What it looks like, when it happens, what happens between death and resurrection. It is fascinating, so if you're curious about that topic, go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. But yeah, I think without further ado, let's read Alma chapter 41. And now, my son, I have somewhat to say concerning the restoration of which has been spoken. For behold, some have wrested the scriptures, and have gone far astray because of this thing. And I perceive that thy mind has been worried also concerning this thing. But behold, I will explain it unto thee. I say unto thee, my son, that the plan of restoration is requisite with the justice of God, for it is requisite that all things should be restored to their proper order. Behold, it is requisite and just, according to the power and resurrection of Christ, that the soul of man should be restored to its body, and that every part of the body should be restored to itself. And it is requisite with the justice of God that men should be judged according to their works, and if their works were good in this life, and the desires of their hearts were good, that they should also, at the last day, be restored unto that which is good. And if their works are evil, they shall be restored unto them for evil. Therefore all things shall be restored to their proper order, everything to its natural frame, mortality raised to immortality, corruption to incorruption, raised to endless happiness, to inherit the kingdom of God, or to endless misery, to inherit the kingdom of the devil, the one on one hand, and the other on the other. So now it seems like Alma is reassuring his son that, he words it as, a restoration of prophet's words. He actually says it a couple times in Alma 40, which I didn't really mention in that chapter, but I do find it interesting because it does seem that apparently some prophets talked about restoration and resurrection in the same way that Alma is, but at some point it got lost and it needed to be restored, like Alma is saying. And he's also saying that there are apparently a lot of people that didn't like this doctrine, and so they left it. Maybe they changed it, something like that. Maybe it got lost in some way. But either way, it was abandoned, and now Alma is trying to restore this teaching among the church, which is actually a really interesting thing. So before Joseph Smith or anything, there were little restorations happening among the Nephites, which is super freaking neat. Also, it's interesting that Alma here uses the word requisite so many times when talking about how correct the plan of God is and how just and merciful it is, because the word requisite means necessary. It means necessary and good. And I think that it is fascinating that he's like, well, actually, if you think about it, if you understand the doctrine, then this situation that we have with resurrection, how it works, the spirit world, spirit prison situation, is necessary. So it's not only good, it's not only true, but it's necessary. What about God's plan of salvation makes this whole setup necessary? That is what is interesting me in this chapter. But all in all, in verses 3 and 4, he kind of sums it up. He's like, by the way, it's requisite with the justice of God that men should be judged according to their works. And then he goes on to talk about how good people inherit good things and bad people inherit bad things. And I actually have a note on the last sentence of verse 4, which says, one on the one hand and the other on the other. It's a very black and white view still. That's what my note says. And I think that that is because we have further modern revelation today that says, well, what happens after we're judged for our works isn't just yes or no. It isn't heaven or hell. It's a little bit more than that. Spirit prison and spirit paradise, sure, that's a little bit more black and white. But after we're judged, there is nuance, which I think is lovely because we as humans are nuanced, and it always felt weird to me, this doctrine that people believe about heaven and hell. Either you're saved or you're not, and that is it, full stop. We are nuanced people, and a just God would understand that we are nuanced. Maybe we didn't follow God completely well, but maybe we had excuses. Maybe we had life circumstances that got in the way, and maybe something about a personality just doesn't predispose us to do certain things, and it's not necessarily our fault. And I love that God's mercy plans for that God's plan has in place situations that we can find ourselves in after judgment that we will be comfortable in, regardless of how we were in life. And I think that's pretty freaking awesome. The one raised to happiness according to his desires of happiness, or good according to his desires of good, and the other evil according to his desires of evil, for he has desired to do evil all the day long, even so shall he have his reward of evil when the night cometh. And so it is on the other hand, if he hath repented of his sins, and desired righteousness until the end of his days, even so he shall be rewarded unto righteousness. These are they that are redeemed of the Lord, yea, these are they that are taken out, that are delivered from that endless night of darkness, and thus they stand or fall. For behold, they are their own judges, whether to do good or do evil. Now the decrees of God are unalterable, therefore the way is prepared that whosoever will may walk therein and be saved. And now behold, my son, do not risk one more offense against your God upon those points of doctrine which ye have hitherto risked to commit sin. Do not suppose, because it has been spoken concerning restoration, that ye shall be restored from sin to happiness. Behold, I say unto you, wickedness never was happiness. I love that last phrase in verse 10. Wickedness never was happiness. You could say wickedness never is happiness, wickedness never will be happiness, but using the term was there paints in my mind the picture of someone who has lived their life in wickedness, and they've always thought that it was happiness, but then they have this moment of realization and they realize, oh, this whole thing that I've been experiencing, this life that I've lived, it never was happiness. It has never been happiness. And it just paints in my mind a picture of this realization that someone has. And I absolutely love that. And that makes sense for Alma, too. If you remember his backstory, he used to be wicked. He used to go around destroying the church until an angel spiritually backhanded him and put him in a coma. You know? He used to be wicked. And now he knows that the fruits of his wickedness was not happiness. And it never was. I love that phrase. Because a lot of people find wickedness, whether it be more light sin or whether it's more serious things, they do it because that's how they think they will be happy. And if you realize that it never really leads to long-term abiding happiness or peace or joy, then it's a lot easier to dodge those decisions that lead you down that road. Anyways, I just absolutely love the wording of that sentence, and it's such a good phrase. I freaking love it. And now, my son, all men that are in a state of nature, or I would say in a carnal state, are in the gall of bitterness and in the bonds of iniquity. They are without God in the world, and they have gone contrary to the nature of God. Therefore, they are in a state contrary to the nature of happiness. And now behold, is the meaning of the word restoration to take a thing of a natural state and place it in an unnatural state, or to place it in a state opposite to its nature? Oh, my son, this is not the case, but the meaning of the word restoration is to bring back again evil for evil, or carnal for carnal, or devilish for devilish, good for that which is good, righteous for that which is righteous, just for that which is just, merciful for that which is merciful. So it's interesting that not only is Alma talking about how this idea of resurrection is kind of a restoration of the words of the prophets previous, but also he's calling the resurrection a restoration in itself, because you're being restored to the fruits of your actions. And it's so fascinating how he says at the end of verse 11 and in verses 12 and 13 that those who sin are contrary to the nature of God, and they are in a state contrary to the nature of happiness. Which, first of all, that's interesting because it parallels God to the very nature of happiness, which is interesting. But then he goes on to say the definition of restoration is not to restore something to a state contrary to its own self. You can't change something and call that restoration. And so I love how he says, if you sin, you place yourself contrary to God and happiness itself. And therefore, when you're resurrected, you can't be restored to happiness, because that would be unnatural and therefore not a restoration, in the way that resurrection is a restoration. So yeah, what God is judging here is our nature. He's not necessarily judging individual actions or individual thoughts that we have. He's judging our nature. Are we making our nature Christ-like? Are we making it so that we recognize the name of Christ as our own name? Have we taken his name upon us to a point where our nature is aligning with his? Where our nature is one that can be restored unto God and not restored unto wickedness? I just love that idea because, again, God isn't counting up sins versus counting up number of sacraments taken. You know, he's not tallying things up. There's nuance. And he cares about the content of our character and our soul so much more than the surface level stuff. So much more than the number of sins or the number of good deeds done. Therefore, my son, see that you are merciful unto your brethren, deal justly, judge righteously, and do good continually. And if ye do all these things, then shall ye receive your reward. Yea, ye shall have mercy restored unto you again, ye shall have justice restored unto you again, ye shall have a righteous judgment restored unto you again, and ye shall have good rewarded unto you again. For that which ye do send out shall return unto you again, and be restored. Therefore the word restoration more fully condemneth a sinner, and justifieth him not at all. So what a fascinating chapter. So it's kind of riding off the coattails of last chapter where Alma talks about resurrection as a concept, and now he's defining specifically what resurrection will look like for us in the final judgment kind of sense. He calls it repeatedly a restoration, not only of our physical body, which we've already talked about, but also of our nature. If the nature that we create for ourselves on Earth, or maybe even in spirit prison when we're getting taught to, that cannot be changed. That is something that we do, in fact, take into the afterlife. And that is something that we should care about. And I think Alma's point is summed up very well at the very end of the chapter in verse 15, where he says, For that which ye do send out shall return unto you again, and be restored. So if you love others, you will be loved. If you judge righteously, you will be judged righteously. Does that not sound exceedingly just? Does that not sound fair and merciful even? Because again, like I've said, he's not counting up sins. He's not saying, yeah, you lived the end of your life really well and you really turned back to God, but like, man, it took you like 40 years to get here. Like, I don't know, it's kind of detracting on your resume. That's not what God's doing here. God is the type to forgive you of your sins, but also care about your nature and look at the content of your soul. And so this gives me a lot of hope, because God doesn't necessarily care if I read the scriptures every single day, if I say morning prayers every single day, but he does care that I turn to him often. And he does care that when I'm struggling, he is the first person that I look at, and he is the first person that I put my trust in. That is what he cares about, and therefore that is what I care about. So although the verse 10 phrase, wickedness never was happiness, is my favorite phrase, my favorite verse that I'm going to make the standout verse for this chapter is actually verse 14, and I'm only going to read the section that I have underlined because it's kind of a long verse, but it says, Deal justly, judge righteously, and do good continually, and if ye do all these things, then shall ye receive your reward. Yea, ye shall have mercy restored unto you again. So this just kind of sums up Alma's point. He just says, deal justly, judge righteously, do good continually, and then you will be rewarded for your actions. God does care about our works. Yes, we are ultimately saved by grace. Yes, that is what ultimately does it for us. But God cares about what we do. God cares if we obey his commandments. God cares if we look unto him in every thought. God cares if we deal justly and judge righteously, because how we judge others influences how he judges us. And so it's important to remember that we're all children of God. And that if you're in the service of your fellow man, you're only in the service of your God. So this chapter made me think of karma very much, especially like I mentioned that phrase in verse 15, that which you do send out shall return unto you again. That definitely sounds like karma. And that definitely is kind of the vibe of this chapter, to be honest. Alma's talking all about restoration and how you can only be restored to that which you are. Like, you can't be restored to a state that is contrary to your own nature. And yeah, what you get is what you deal, you know? Anyways, that is the episode. I hope you enjoyed. I had a lot of fun reading this. Again, it's really short, but dang, wickedness never was happiness? Bars. Anyways, there's just a few links down in the show notes that I want to let you know about. Firstly, there's a let me know what you learned link, so if you're going to shoot me a message, you can do that there, or you can just DM me on Instagram. Secondly, there are some links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon, so if you don't have your own copy but you want to read along or find a favorite chapter or a favorite verse, you can go ahead and click those. Thirdly, there is a quick support the show link, so if you're going to shoot me a few dollars and support what I do, that would be wonderfully appreciated. Next, we are on YouTube, so if you're going to go subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can find some trivia, but most importantly, you can access the podcast on that platform, so if you want to listen to it twice a week there, you can. And finally, we are on Instagram, so if you want to follow me on Instagram, that is where I'm the most active, I post the most often, and also you get the most up-to-date trivia, so good times. Anyways, I will see you there. But yeah, I think that's all I have for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.